Minnesota Territory, 1874. Every homesteader in that valley was racing the frost to seal their cabins shut, and there was Nora Searn, a Scottish widow hauling river clay from the creek bed in a wooden bucket, one trip at a time, 3 weeks running. Her neighbors had long since finished their chinking with the standard mud and hay method that every practical soul on the frontier relied upon. A few fistfuls shoved into the gaps between logs, smoothed flat, left to harden. Done. 2 weeks of honest effort, maybe 3 if a man fussed over his corners. Nora Searn had been working her walls for 11 weeks straight, and she was not filling cracks. She was constructing something no one around her could recognize. 8 inches of river clay blended with crushed stone and dried grass, packed between an interior board and the outer log face, pressed by hand in dense layers, tamped with a flat-headed mallet, sealed at every joint with still more clay, left to cure in the September air before the next course went on top. The entire operation looked magnificently pointless to anyone passing by, which was everyone, and every last one of them said so. Men shook their heads. Women clucked their disapproval. Old Garrett Foss, who'd been working that stretch of Minnesota river bottom since before most of his neighbors had learned to hold a razor, pulled his horse up at her fence line on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. He watched her work for a solid minute without opening his mouth. Then he spoke. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, zero, underscore, underscore. And he wrote on. She kept tamping. What Nora Searn knew about stone and clay, about the slow, patient way dense material holds heat, knew from a lifetime in the Scottish Highlands where black houses had stood on this same principle for 4 centuries. That knowledge was about to be proven in the most brutal and undeniable fashion the Minnesota frontier could deliver. January of 1875 brought a cold snap so vicious it froze the river solid in 3 days. Livestock died in barns their owners had judged more than sufficient. Interior cabin temperatures dropped below freezing in homes where families had been feeding their stoves without pause for a full week. Nora Searn let her fire burn down to coals at midnight. She slept through the coldest night of the decade, did not add a single log. When she opened her eyes at dawn, her bread dough, set out to rise the evening before, had done precisely what bread dough does in a warm room. The walls were still releasing every degree she had ever given them. 14 hours since the last true fire, her cabin held more warmth than most of her neighbors managed at the height of their burning. What she grasped about thermal mass, about heat storage, about the difference between blocking cold and absorbing warmth, modern building science would spend the next 100 years wrestling into equations what one widowed Scotswoman had solved with her hands, her memory, and a creek full of excellent clay. Nora Macaulay Kearn reached Minnesota Territory in the spring of 1873. 3 children, 1 ox, a cast iron pot, and the kind of composure that only forms inside a person who has already survived what should have destroyed her completely. Her husband, Duncan Kearn, had crossed from Glasgow the year prior to scout the land and file the claim. He'd been dead of cholera 6 months before she arrived, buried somewhere near St. Paul by strangers who had known him a fortnight. The land agent who placed the claim papers in her hands seemed faintly surprised she meant to continue. She thanked him with courtesy and asked directions to the nearest mill. 38 years old, 5 feet 4 inches of controlled practicality. Reddish-brown hair knotted back so tightly her children had never once seen it fall loose. She spoke with a Highland accent that rounded her consonants and sometimes confused her neighbors. They mistook her careful, deliberate speech for uncertainty. It was not uncertainty, it was precision. Nora did not speak words she hadn't weighed, did not make promises beyond her reach, and she did not, under any circumstances, raise walls she hadn't thought all the way through. She had 3 children. Ewan, 12, tall like his father and grave like his mother. Elspeth, 9, who resembled neither parent and remained perfectly cheerful about the fact. And little Callum, 6, young enough during the Atlantic crossing that Scotland existed for him only as a word other people used. Minnesota was simply the world. He met it with the untroubled openness of a child who has nothing to compare anything against. They were competent children. This was not optional. A widow proving up a homestead claim needed every pair of hands working. Nora made this plain from the first day. Everyone labored. Everyone shouldered what they could. Callum's share was small, but he was growing fast, and each season his portion increased. The land agent in St. Paul who passed her the claim papers wore an expression Nora would later recognize. The careful neutrality of a man swallowing advice he suspects will not be welcome. He swallowed it. This was professionally intelligent of him. Nora had already sealed her decision shut like mortar in a wall joint, and any attempt to pry it open would have left both parties uncomfortable. She thanked him, took the documents, walked out into the morning with 3 children trailing behind her, in the particular concentrated force of a woman who has taken raw grief and hammered it into momentum, and means to keep swinging. The claim occupied a bend along the Crow River, in territory that would one day organize itself into Wright County. Rolling ground, rich bottomland, hardwood timber thick enough for building, and a creek running south of the property where the current eased around bends and left clay deposits exposed in the banks. Nora found the clay on her 3rd morning, before she had even chosen a cabin site. She crouched in her boots at the water's edge and drove her thumb into the exposed face. Gray-blue, dense, the kind that holds its form when rolled between fingers, the kind that bakes stone hard under open sun. She knew it instantly. Her father had used nearly identical material her entire childhood, pressing fresh clay into the outer walls of the family black house outside Ullapool. Walls that in places ran more than 3 feet thick, rubble stone and packed earth bound together into a massive, dense body, sheathed in turf on the outside. Those walls did not keep cold out the way a thin, tight shell blocks wind. They did something stranger, something far more powerful. They stored heat, slowly, over hours and days of fire burning within. That mass of stone and compressed earth drank warmth the way a cast iron pan drinks heat from a stove, deep into its center, until the material itself was warm, clear through. Then when the fire guttered or the storm descended, those walls did not simply go cold. They gave the warmth back, gradually, steadily, over 12 hours, sometimes 16, radiating stored heat inward long after the last flame had died to ash. Highland winters were savage things. The black houses survived them not by fighting cold away, but by holding enough warmth inside their bones to outlast the worst. Nora had lived her first 18 years inside one of those structures. She understood exactly what her thumb was pressing into on that Minnesota riverbank. The Black House, where she grew up, perched on a hillside 2 miles from Ullapool, its face turned toward the prevailing westerly wind with a kind of stoic acceptance that the building culture of Minnesota would have found entirely foreign. It was not beautiful by any outward standard, a long, low mass of rubble stone and compacted earth, walls so thick they resembled less a human construction and more a geological event that had decided to have an opinion about shelter. Inside, dark and hazy by any modern measure, the central hearth burned peat the way Highland fires had always burned it, filling the upper air with smoke that drifted slowly upward until it found its way through a gap in the thatch. The floor was packed earth laid over stone, swept each day, replaced when it wore through. One door, low-framed, no windows in any conventional sense, only gaps that could be stuffed with peat or wadded cloth when weather turned vicious. By every standard the Minnesota settlement community would have applied in 1874, this dwelling was primitive. By the only standard that truly counted on January nights, when the Atlantic hurled sleet horizontal across the hillside, and the temperature hovered somewhere in the territory of deadly, by that standard, the Black House was a triumph of thermal engineering. Those walls, 3 feet thick at their widest, absorbed heat from the ever-burning fire all day long and released it slowly through the darkness into the next morning. They held an entire day's worth of flame through an entire night's worth of sleep, without a soul rising to feed the coals. Nora's mother had smothered that hearth every evening of Nora's girlhood and risen every dawn to stonework still warm enough for bread to prove against. The house was not comfortable in any gentle way. It was warm in the way that keeps you alive, which is a different thing entirely, a more essential thing. The cabin she raised that first summer followed the familiar frontier pattern in its bones. Pine logs notched at the corners in the standard method, one main room with a sleeping loft above for the children, a fireplace of stone and clay along the north wall, and a door set east to catch the earliest light. Her neighbor two claims north, a German farmer named Rolf Vetter, helped her lift the walls in August. He brought two of his sons and a borrowed cant hook. They finished in a day and a half with the easy competence of men who had done this a dozen times before. He told her she would have the chinking complete in 2 weeks if she started Monday morning and didn't overthink it. He was not wrong in the general sense. Most settlers finished in 2 weeks. Nora was not most settlers. She let the logs sit for a fortnight first, watched where they shifted, tracked how the gaps widened or narrowed as the greenwood dried and twisted in the heat. She was still watching when Rolf rode past in early September and noticed she had not yet touched the chinking. He said nothing directly. Rolf Vetter was a decent man, but he carried the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. When she finally began, it was not with mud and hay. The method she had devised across those 2 weeks of careful study started at the creek. She dug clay from the bank where it curved smoothest and ran cleanest, filling her wooden bucket and hauling it back to the cabin on trips that cost 20 minutes each direction. Her 12-year-old son Ewan joined after the first week. They found a rhythm together, Ewan carrying, Nora blending. She combined the raw clay with 2 parts crushed stone, flat-sided chips she had broken from the granite field stones quarried for the fireplace foundation, and 1 part dried grass cut short. She worked the 3 materials in a wooden trough with a measure of water until the texture fell somewhere between bread dough and mortar, dense enough to hold form when pressed, yielding enough to follow every ridge and hollow in the log surface without splitting as it cured. But before she pushed a single handful of this mixture into the wall, she built the inner form. Against the interior face of each log, she nailed rough-sawn pine boards on simple ledgers, a second surface set roughly 8 inches inside the log face. This created a cavity between the board and the outer wall. She was not filling gaps, she was filling a deliberate void. The clay-stone mixture went in from the top, pressed down by hand in layers she called lifts. Each lift ran about 4 inches deep, each one tamped solid with a flat mallet before the next one on. She worked from the bottom of every cavity to its crown. It took her 11 weeks. That number shattered something in the collective imagination of the settlement. 11 weeks of dawn to dusk labor on every day the fieldwork spared her. Ewan hauling clay, her younger daughter Elspeth mixing material in the trough, Nora pressing it into place with hands that ached and swelled and kept going. The neighbors marked the calendar with the particular disbelief that frontier communities saved for people who spent time on things no one could see the point of. Garrett Foss paid his Tuesday visit in late September and offered his assessment that winter would not care how fine the walls looked. Rolf Vetter came by in early October. He studied the work. He studied Nora. He studied the work again. Then very carefully he said that she had certainly been thorough. His wife Marta carried less restraint at the weekly gathering. She wondered aloud whether Nora had perhaps mistaken thoroughness for plain stubbornness. The woman beside her let out a quiet laugh. Nora, across the room, elected not to hear it. Then there was the matter of her sex. A woman doing this alone. The settlement found it simultaneously impressive and faintly unsettling. A widow building her own claim, acceptable, admirable, even. A widow who appeared to understand things about construction that the men around her did not. That was harder to place in any familiar category. Garrett Foss had raised 6 cabins in Minnesota. Rolf Vetter had raised 4. Neither man had ever heard of packing crushed stone and clay into a cavity wall. The fact that a recently arrived Scotswoman was doing it with visible conviction made them uncertain in a way they could not sit comfortably with. The uncertainty expressed itself mostly as dismissal, because dismissal was easier. The schoolmaster, a young man from Connecticut named Aldous Grant, who had arrived the previous year carrying a teaching certificate and an enormous supply of opinions, stopped at Nora's fence one afternoon. He asked whether she had any empirical basis for her construction method. Nora explained the Black House tradition in 3 sentences. Aldous listened with care. Then he said that anecdotal historical practice was not a substitute for established engineering principles, which was technically true in the same way that telling a fish its gills are not a recognized respiratory mechanism is technically true, accurate, impressive sounding, and completely beside the point. She thanked him for his perspective and returned to tamping. He rode off wearing the expression of a man who has delivered important information and cannot fathom why it was not more gratefully received. The comment from the settlement that Nora found most interesting, if she was honest with herself, came from a woman named Jean Brunt. Jean's husband had built what everyone agreed was the finest cabin in the valley. Good squared logs, tight chinking, a real glass window on the south side, 2 rooms and a sleeping loft. Jean was not unkind, but she carried the particular assurance of someone married to the settlement's best builder. One afternoon she said to Nora with genuine puzzlement, "But won't all that clay just crack in the cold and fall right out?" A perfectly reasonable question. Nora answered it with the patience she kept stored for reasonable questions, delivered in the tone of settled conclusions. "Only if it's packed wrong," Nora said, "and only if it hasn't cured properly before the freeze." Jean considered this a moment, then said, "Well, I suppose you'd know." The tone implied that Nora would not necessarily know, but that arguing with someone mid-mallet swing seemed rude. "What's wrong with standard chinking?" Garrett asked her one morning in October. He stood watching her tamp a fresh lift of clay into the south wall cavity with the mallet. "Nothing's wrong with it," Nora said without pausing her work. "Then why all the extra trouble?" "Standard chinking keeps wind out. This keeps heat in." She patted the surface of the dried clay in the section she'd finished 2 weeks prior. Quote, _9 __. Garrett considered this, found he had no immediate answer for it, and left. What Nora was building had a name in the language of modern material science that nobody on the Minnesota frontier in 1874 had yet encountered: thermal mass. The principle is simple enough to explain, but counterintuitive enough that it surprises people meeting it for the first time. Most approaches to keeping a structure warm concern themselves with resistance, stopping cold from entering, blocking wind, sealing gaps. Insulation in the conventional sense works by slowing the transfer of heat from warm interior to cold exterior. It creates a barrier that resists thermal movement. Standard frontier chinking did precisely this: sealed the cracks, reduced infiltration, gave the fire a fighting chance against outside air. But resistance and storage are 2 entirely different strategies. A thin, tight wall resists cold while the fire burns. When the fire dies, the resistance remains, but nothing is stored behind it. The air inside cools rapidly. Because air has almost no capacity to hold heat, it warms in a hurry and surrenders that warmth just as quick, rising, slipping through every crack, gone the instant the source dies. What Nora was constructing was something else entirely: a reservoir. Heavy materials, stone, packed clay, mineral-dense composites, possess what physicists call high specific heat capacity. They absorb thermal energy grudgingly. Over many hours of sustained heating, but that same stubbornness works in reverse. They surrender heat just as slowly. The warmth lives inside the mass itself, not in the air hovering before it. When the fire goes out, the wall doesn't turn cold. It gives back what it's stored. Gradually, steadily, hour after hour, the way a stone pulled from a fire and tucked into a bed keeps a sleeping body warm long after the flames have died to ash. The river clay Nora used carried thermal properties she understood, not from any book, but from a lifetime of touching, shaping, living with the material. Wet clay conducts heat well during the warming phase. It accepts energy readily, spreading it through its mass. Dried and compacted, that same clay becomes something different: a slow-release store, giving back warmth at a gentle, even rate that holds interior temperature long after the external heat is gone. The crushed granite she folded into the mix added weight, increased storage capacity. Stone holds roughly twice the thermal energy of wood per unit volume. The dried grass gave the composite enough internal structure to resist cracking as it cured, the same role straw had played in the earthen walls of Scottish black houses for centuries. The 8-inch cavity she packed was not ornamental. It was calculated. 8 inches of dense claystone composite, heated by a sustained interior fire, could store enough warmth to keep a livable temperature for 12 to 16 hours after the flames went dark. Nora had never tested this with instruments. She had simply grown up in a house where it happened. She trusted what her own body had felt on frozen mornings in Ullapool. Her neighbors trusted what they had built. Standard mud and hay chinking, pressed thin between logs, an inch thick at best, drying to something with the thermal performance of cardboard. It blocked the wind well enough on quiet nights. It did considerably less when conditions turned. The first real sign that the settlement was walking into a winter worth remembering arrived in early December. The temperature plunged to 22 below zero. It stayed there for 4 straight days. The old-timers called it a cold snap rather than a storm. No wind, no snow, just a bone-white stillness that settled over the river valley like a breath held too long. Garrett Foss burned through 2 full cords of wood in those 4 days, roughly double his expected rate for the season. He woke every morning to frost glazing the interior walls near the windows, despite fires he had fed around the clock. His wife, Bet, told the women at the church social that she had taken to sleeping in her coat. She said it with the flat matter-of-factness of someone who had been doing it for a week and was past caring what anyone thought. The Vedders fared no better. Rolf was a methodical man who had calculated his wood supply against a conservative winter estimate. Now he stood before his shrinking stacks with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he did not want the answer to. His cabin was well built by every reasonable standard. Tight corners, good chinking, a proper door seal. The cold came through anyway, the way extreme cold passes through any single thin barrier, steadily, relentlessly, 1 degree at a time. Eventually, the fire's output and the cold's penetration met at equilibrium, a temperature barely above survival. Nora burned roughly a third of what her neighbors did during those 4 days. Her walls had been curing since October, 2 full months absorbing the mild autumn temperatures, settling into a thermally stable state. When she lit her fires in November and held them steady, the claystone mass began its slow, patient accumulation of stored warmth. By December, those walls held warmth not just at the surface, but deep, through the full 8 inches of packed cavity. They had absorbed enough thermal energy to actively contribute heat to her interior, not merely resist the cold pressing in from outside. The difference showed most clearly underfoot. Her packed earth floor stayed warmer than any reasonable expectation because the wall bases radiated heat downward into the ground at the room's perimeter. The soil beneath the floor carried that warmth. Her children padded barefoot across it in the morning. The Vedder children, Marta mentioned, pulled on full winter layers before they dared leave their beds. Nora said nothing about this, but she noticed. What came in January of 1875 was not a storm. Not in any way that word is normally understood. No blizzard roared through, no drifts climbed the windows. No visible spectacle gave neighbors something to compare afterward. What descended on the night of January 14th was pure cold. An Arctic mass slid down from the north and pressed itself over the river valley with such totality that the people living beneath it felt not weather, but a shift in the basic terms of existence. Garrett Foss's thermometer read 36 below zero at dawn on the 15th. By noon, the needle had not budged. By the next dawn, it had sunk to 38 below, the lowest temperature any settler in the community had ever recorded in all their years on their claims. The air did not move. No wind, no snow, no theater of any kind. Only cold so deep and so patient that wood fires began to feel like sentimental gestures, the efforts of people who had not yet grasped what stood against them. The sky turned that specific shade of blue that exists only when the air holds almost no moisture. Hard, brilliant, without mercy. Beautiful the way dangerous things are beautiful. The way a flooding river is beautiful, admirable from a distance, lethal up close. Chimney smoke climbed in perfect vertical lines through the motionless air. This was the one dramatic flourish that deep Arctic cold permits. From a distance, the settlement looked like a painting. A dozen white columns rising against that pitiless blue, each one marking a family burning wood into a fire that was barely holding ground. Inside the Foss cabin, Bet had moved the water pail to within 3 feet of the stove the night before. She had covered it with cloth. By morning it had frozen anyway, not solid, but a thick crust of ice across the surface that she cracked with a spoon before she could pour. She had seen this before in hard winters past, but only when the pail sat near the door, never when it sat near the stove. That stove was burning oak she had split in October. Good seasoned hardwood. The cast iron glowed dull red at the firebox door, running as hot as it could run. The cold was winning anyway. The particular cruelty of extreme cold in its static, settled form is that it strips away the difference between a structure that blocks wind and a structure that actually retains warmth. When cold rides on wind, the fight is about infiltration, sealing gaps, stopping moving air from stealing heat. But when cold simply sits there, motionless, total, patient, the fight becomes purely about thermal resistance and storage. How much heat can the walls hold? How efficiently does the mass absorb and keep the energy the fire pours into it? And here, thin, chinking, and single-layer log walls showed their fundamental weakness, with a honesty no carpentry skill could hide. Log walls on their own carry modest thermal mass. Wood is less dense than stone or packed clay. Its specific heat capacity is lower. It warms fast, but surrenders warmth just as readily. A well-sealed log cabin in moderate cold holds a workable temperature through tight joints and relentless fire management. At 38 below, sustained across 48 hours, that arithmetic collapsed. Wood absorbed cold from the exterior face, conducted it through to the interior surface, and radiated it into living space, a process that demanded constant, enormous fuel consumption simply to hold the line. Families were not heating their homes. They were locked in a war against the cold that devoured firewood faster than anyone had imagined possible. Garrett Foss went through his last 3 cords in 48 hours. He hadn't prepared for this. No one in the settlement had, because his original stockpile had looked generous against any winter a reasonable person could picture. By the morning of January 16th, he was splitting his own fence rails and feeding them to the stove with the steady calm of a man who has already accepted that fences can be rebuilt in spring, but frozen children cannot. The glass thermometer he kept on a nail near the center of his cabin read 17 degrees at dawn. His fire had not gone out all night. The walls returned nothing because they held nothing to return. The mud and hay chinking packed between his logs measured perhaps 3/4 of an inch at its thickest points. It had never accumulated any real thermal mass, no matter how long the fires burned. Bet Foss, a practical woman, not one for panic or overstatement, sent her eldest boy through the snow to the vetters carrying a note. It read simply, __quote _ 10 __. The vetter boy returned with an answer, __quote _11 _. Both families had retreated to the smallest corners of their cabins. Both burned everything at hand. Both watched their breath cloud the air 3 feet from their stoves. The third family in that nearest cluster of claims was the Whitmores. Daniel and Clara Whitmore and their 2 young children had come to the territory the previous spring from Ohio. Daniel had built a cabin he called solid. Structurally, he was right. Thermally, it performed like a well-organized pile of cold wood. Clara's youngest, a girl of 3 named May, had developed a tight, croupy cough in the night. Clara knew that sound. It was the sound of a child breathing air colder than a child that age should breathe. She wrapped the girl in every blanket she owned, held her against the stove, and felt, for the first time since she had chosen to follow her husband west, a fear that was not abstract, not distant, immediate. Nora Cern's cabin on the morning of January 16th held 47 degrees. She had banked the fire to coals at midnight, not dead, but reduced to the kind of settled ember bed that required no tending until well past dawn. She had done this on purpose, partly from exhaustion, partly from curiosity. She had been wondering about this since October. How warm would her walls hold? For how long? Under a genuine test. The colder the winter, the better the data. Her father had told her that once, about something else entirely, but she had kept the principle. She had spent 18 years in that black house outside Ullapool. She carried a reasonable expectation of what dense clay walls could achieve. She had never, until this winter, faced conditions severe enough to measure it properly. By midnight, after a full day of fire, her walls had been absorbing heat for 11 weeks. They were as warm as packed clay stone walls get. Warm at the surface, warm through the middle layers, warm deep into the 8-inch cavity. They carried enough stored thermal energy to contribute meaningfully to the air inside, rather than simply failing to oppose the cold without. When she let the fire drop to coals, the walls did not notice. They went on radiating that stored warmth inward, a slow, even, invisible heat that kept the air from collapsing toward the temperature outside. It was not the dramatic warmth of a roaring fire, it was the modest, dependable warmth of a stone that has sat near a hearth all afternoon. Not hot, but not cold, not negotiating with you about whether it intended to keep working, just continuing to release what it had stored the energy to hold. She woke at 6 in the morning. 14 hours since the fire had last been properly stoked, her breath was not quite visible. The thermometer on a nail near the center of the south wall read 47 degrees. Outside, the thermometer nailed to the post read 38 below. The gap between those two numbers stretched across 85 degrees. Every single one of them had been pressed into the walls by her own hands. One scoop of clay at a time. 11 weeks of labor the settlement had observed with puzzled politeness and gentle condescension. The bread dough she'd placed in the warmest corner the night before had risen perfectly by morning. Yeast performs exactly as yeast should when the air around it holds steady within a livable range. That does not happen inside a cabin where the temperature is cratered below 40 while a family sleeps. She registered this with a quiet, private satisfaction. Then she coaxed the fire back from its coals, not frantically, not with the raw desperation of someone dragging warmth back from the brink. With the unhurried efficiency of a woman who understood the crisis had already been handled, and the fire was a gesture toward comfort, not a defense against death. Then she glanced through the small south-facing window and saw no smoke rising from Garrett Foss's chimney. At 6 in the morning and 38 below, that was not a small thing to notice. She brought soup. This is the detail everyone who retold the story afterward held on to, and it reveals something exact about Nora Searn. She did not simply bring herself. She set a pot of potato and salt beef broth over the fire to warm while she bundled her children and laced her boots. She carried it across the snow wrapped in cloth with the steady ease of a woman who had decided soup was required and had simply gone ahead and made it. Garrett Foss answered his own door when she knocked. He looked like a man who had spent the night watching hope contract. Past his shoulder, the interior of his cabin was visibly dark, visibly cold, the kind of space that forms when a fire has been losing its war against the walls for 2 days running. Bet sat near the stove beneath a coat and 2 quilts, and the expression that crossed her face when she saw Nora holding that pot was something no one would have tried to put into words. Nora brought both families back to her cabin. 3 trips through the snow, moving children, carrying the Whitmore baby, none of it dramatic, none of it ceremonial. She looked at the situation, concluded there was room enough, and began moving people. By 9 that morning, she had Garrett and Bet Foss, Rolf and Marta Vetter with their 4 children, Daniel and Clara Whitmore with their 2 daughters, 11 souls altogether, inside a cabin holding at 51 degrees. The fire rebuilt to a proper burn, the temperature climbing toward its usual range without any rush. May Whitmore's croup eased within an hour of breathing that warm, steady air. The child's breathing loosened from the tight, labored rhythm Clara had spent the whole night tracking, settling into something closer to normal. By noon, she was asleep in a corner. the deep, unhurried sleep of a small body that has finally stopped fighting. What the adults felt inside that cabin over the next 24 hours ran deeper than physical warmth. It was the particular shift that moves through a mind when a body held in crisis for 2 days is finally given permission to let go. Garrett Foss, who had not sat down without springing back up for 48 hours, lowered himself into Nora's chair beside the fire. He did not move for an hour. He did not speak. He sat in the warmth, the way a person sinks into water after long cold, completely, with a surrender that is also a kind of rescue. Marta Vetter, not a woman anyone would have called sentimental, wept briefly and quietly into a cloth. Then she composed herself and began helping Elspeth manage the children. That is what practical women do with feeling once they have finished briefly allowing it. Rolf Vetter lowered himself to the floor, his back pressed against Nora's south wall. After a few moments, he reached behind him, laid his palm flat against the surface. Quote 12, quote, he said. His voice carried the tone of a man reporting something he cannot yet fully explain. Nora said. He held his hand there a long while, feeling something he had been told for 11 weeks was foolish excess, something that was now making its own case far more convincingly than any argument she could ever have offered. He finally raised his eyes to her with the look of a man who has reached the border of his own knowledge and is absorbing that fact with gravity rather than pride. What crossed his face was something near true respect, not politeness, which costs nothing, but the harder thing that must be earned over time. Ewan, watching from his corner among the Vetter children, saw this and understood something he could not yet name. He had spent 11 weeks carrying clay from the creek in a wooden bucket, one trip at a time, because that was what the work demanded. He had been 12 years old, pressing clay into wall cavities in dying light, while other boys had long finished their tasks and moved on to easier things. He had never complained about it, not because he couldn't, but because his mother hadn't raised him to protest necessary labor, and he had been old enough to sense, if not articulate, that whatever she was building deserved to be built. He had simply trusted her judgment the way a child trusts a parent who has never spent that trust carelessly. He looked at Rolf's hand flat against the wall. He looked at the Whitmore baby sleeping in the corner, breathing easy for the first time in 2 weeks. He looked at his mother portioning soup into cups for 11 people with the same measured calm she carried into everything, moving through her own crowded house like someone standing exactly where she always intended to stand. Then he returned to his task, keeping the Vetter children busy, and said nothing. But something that had been taking shape inside him, across 11 weeks of hauling clay, had completed itself. He knew without speaking it that the work had been right, and that some kinds of rightness need time before they show their face. The physics behind what Nora's walls accomplished had a clarity anyone could understand once they pressed a hand to the surface and felt it. Stone and dense clay absorb and hold heat in proportion to their mass, not merely their surface area, not merely the air temperature surrounding them, but their actual physical weight and density. A single pound of dry granite stores roughly 0.19 British thermal units for every degree Fahrenheit it climbs. Clay runs slightly lower, around 0.16 BTUs per pound per degree. Neither figure sounds remarkable alone. But Nora's walls in their completed state held somewhere between 800 and 1,000 pounds of claystone composite per section. Heated to sustained interior equilibrium through weeks of ordinary fire use, those walls had banked a thermal charge that gave them effective heat output lasting deep into the following day. This is the difference between high-mass construction and high-resistance construction. Resistance performs while the heat source burns. Mass performs when it stops. They guard against different failures entirely. A thin, well-sealed wall that blocks cold efficiently still fails the moment the fuel runs out, the firekeeper falls asleep, or someone gives up at 3 in the morning. A mass wall, dense, heavy, thoroughly warmed, keeps radiating whether anyone tends the flame or not. The failure that killed settlers in extreme cold was never inadequate fire or poor sealing. It was the gap between the moment the fire could no longer be sustained and the moment the sun returned. Mass walls bridge that gap by storing warmth inside the physical body of the building itself. The heat becomes independent of the fire's moment-to-moment life. Nora had never used these words for what she was doing. She would have described it the way her father did. Quote 16. She had grown up inside that truth long before she had theory for it, which is perhaps why she trusted it more deeply than neighbors who had heard the same information secondhand. They found it impossible to believe until they felt it under their palm on a night when the thermometer read 38 below and their children's breath hung white in the air. Garrett Foss felt it first. He was the first to ask about the construction. He did not ask immediately. He waited until the crisis had passed and the families returned to their own claims, which happened on January 19th, when the cold broke enough for travel. He appeared at Nora's door 3 days later, carrying a notebook borrowed from Aldous Grant and a measuring tape he'd fashioned from cord knotted at inch intervals. He did not bring Bet. He did not bring his pride, just the notebook, the cord, and an expression as close to humble as Garrett Foss could physically manage. The man standing on her threshold was not the same Garrett Foss who had ridden past her fence line in September, pronouncing his verdict about winter's indifference to careful walls. That Garrett had possessed the settled assurance of a man who has done something long enough to confuse routine with understanding. This Garrett had spent 3 days turning over the difference between a wall that fights cold and a wall that stores warmth. The turning had cost his confidence something, and the cost was ultimately to his credit. He remained Garrett Foss, stubborn, practical, direct, constitutionally hostile to unnecessary sentiment, but he had come with a notebook. And that notebook was the only shape his humility knew how to take. Quote 17, he asked. Quote 18, quote 19, quote 20. She let him measure it himself. She understood that men like Garrett Foss must put their own hands on a thing before they trust it exists. He measured. Quote 21, she told him. Clay drawn from the creek bank, crushed granite from fieldstone, dried grass cut fine, mixed with just enough water to reach a plastic state, then packed in layers she called lifts. Tamped firm. Each lift cured fully before the next went on. She described the inner board forming the second face of the cavity, how she had nailed it on simple ledgers to maintain the full 8 inches of fill space. She showed him the tamping method, the flat-headed mallet, the technique of pressing clay against both surfaces at once so it bonded to log and inner board alike without trapping air pockets. She explained that air pockets in a mass wall are dead space, gaps where the fill fails to participate in thermal exchange. He wrote everything down, slowly, carefully, the handwriting of a man who did not write often. She watched him and did not make him feel small about it. 22, he said at one point. 23, 24, she said. 25. She picked up a fragment of cured material near the outer wall. 26. He held the piece against his palm, testing its weight. Then he nodded and wrote something else in the notebook. Rolf Vetter arrived 2 days after Garrett. He also carried a notebook, but his questions were more technical, shaped by his background in German agricultural building, where similar principles had been applied to root cellars and granary walls with some regularity. He wanted to know about drying time for each lift, how long she had waited before adding the next layer, how she had known when the clay was properly cured. She told him that green clay shrinks as it dries. If you pack a fresh lift on top of undried material, shrinkage in the lower layer tears the upper layer apart, creates fine cracks, invisible at first, that give moisture a pathway inward. And more critically, they give the wall a discontinuity in its thermal mass. Cold spots form where continuity breaks. She had learned this watching her father repair a section of Blackhouse wall in Ullapool that had been packed too quickly one summer. It developed exactly that pattern of hairline fractures. Rolf studied the wall section she described and understood immediately, in the language of materials his own hands already knew. He made notes about waiting time between lifts. Quote, _27, she told him, and about covering completed sections with cloth or bark to slow drying slightly in direct sun. This prevented the surface from hardening too fast, while the center remained wet. Clay that dries too quickly skins over on the outside, but stays soft underneath. The hard skin traps moisture within, prevents proper curing from ever reaching the core. Slow, even curing across the full 8 inches of depth, that was the goal. And she had reached it by shielding fresh sections from direct afternoon sun. Rolf's eldest boy, Hans, 14 years old and carrying that particular intensity you see in young people when new information lands on something already taking shape inside them. He asked whether the same method could be applied to a cabin already standing and lived in. The question caught Nora off guard, not because it missed the mark, because it hit dead center. The exact practical questions she had been waiting for someone to reach. Yes, she said. Harder in winter. Clay won't cure right in cold air. But come spring, March, or April, before the next freeze, you could mount the inner boards, mix the fill dry, pack it loose, then seal it to cure through summer ahead of the following cold. Hans wrote this down on a separate page from his father's notes, folded it, slipped it into his jacket pocket. Nora said nothing about this, but she saw it. Clara Whitmore arrived alone without Daniel on a day in late January when the cold had pulled back to something merely miserable rather than lethal. She sat at Nora's table holding a cup of tea brewed from dried mint Nora had stored in a tin all winter. She was quiet for a stretch before she said what she had come to say. May hasn't coughed since we left here, Clara said. Not once. The whole ride home I kept bracing for it to start. It didn't. Nora nodded. She'd been coughing since November. I thought it was just the season. I didn't think the cold was pushing through the walls. I thought Daniel had built them well enough. She looked down at her hands on the table. He did build them well, for what they are. Nora offered no comment on what they were. She poured more tea. He wants to know if you'll teach him, Clara said. Come spring. He's already planning to drag clay from the creek before the ground locks up again. Store it somewhere dry so the material's ready when the time comes. Tell him to haul double what he thinks he'll need, Nora said. It's always more than you expect. Silence settled between them. Then Clara said quietly, I came to say thank you. You don't need to, Nora said. It was soup. Clara laughed, a short, startled sound half caught by tears. It wasn't the soup, Nora. I know, Nora said, but it's the kind of thing worth saying. The community's relationship with Nora Searn shifted after January of 1875. Not loudly, not with any announcement, but anyone paying attention could feel it. The mockery didn't transform into praise. It was more that the specific energy behind the ridicule dissolved. What replaced it was quieter, a more respectful kind of curiosity. Men who had spent months calling her wall project Nora's Folly or the Scotswoman's Hobby appeared in spring carrying notebooks and questions. And they asked those questions with a different quality of attention. The gap between asking something to win an argument and asking because you genuinely need to know, it has a texture everyone in the room can recognize. What moved through the settlement that spring and into the following summer was not a formal technique, not a school of practice. It was closer to a shared understanding. The communal recognition that the principles Nora had applied were not exotic or foreign. They were ancient. The accumulated logic of people who had built for brutal cold across centuries, long before the American frontier decided speed and simplicity were the only virtues worth honoring. Scottish blackhouse construction was the tradition Nora could name, but the same principle had been used by cliff-dwelling peoples of the American Southwest with their adobe and rammed earth, by Norse builders working stone and turf, by peoples of the Siberian steppe packing structures with sod and compressed earth, by every cold climate building tradition that had survived long enough to learn what dense walls actually accomplish. What all of them understood, and what standard frontier chinking emphatically did not, was the difference between blocking cold and holding warmth. The distinction sounds subtle when you say it plainly. It is enormous in practice, especially at 38 below zero with a sleeping child in the corner and a fire that cannot outrun the cold pressing through a thin wall toward everything you love, every single bore. By the summer of 1875, Daniel Whitmore had made 7 separate trips to haul clay from the creek. He stored it under canvas in his barn, shielding it from freezing through the mild nights. He had adopted Nora's inner board technique and sketched his own diagram, which he brought to Nora for review. She corrected 3 details, told him the rest was exactly right. August and September he spent packing his walls. Evenings after fieldwork, Clara mixing the composite in the trough beside him. The children carried loads back and forth. 10 weeks it took, slightly faster than Nora's 11, because he had her instructions to follow rather than inherited memory to draw from. Rolf Vetter committed to a full repacking of his north and west walls, the 2 that caught the prevailing winter wind. He used a modified mix, swapping a portion of crushed granite for broken river cobble, which he had in greater supply. He had written to a German builder in New Ulm who confirmed the principle was sound. The claystone composite was a recognized technique in traditional German construction. This gave Rolf something useful. What Nora had been doing carried a name in German, Lehmwand, and had been practiced across Central Europe for no fewer than 300 years. He reported this at the settlement's next church gathering with the particular satisfaction of a man who has found documented proof for something he already believed. Nobody raised the obvious question. If it had worked in Germany for 3 centuries, why had everyone waited for Nora to carry it to Minnesota? But that question was likely too uncomfortable to speak aloud. Garrett Foss spent the summer constructing a separate root cellar using a variant of the method. Thick claystone walls, dense, uniform, designed to hold a stable temperature through winter cold and summer heat alike. He did not repack his own cabin walls until the following spring. Time had run out in 1875, but he told Nora the root cellar performed exactly as she had described. Stable temperature through both extremes. No additional insulation, no fire. And this convinced him more deeply than the blizzard had. The blizzard he had partly dismissed as exceptional circumstances. The root cellar worked in ordinary conditions. That meant the principle was reliable, not just spectacular. He did not say any of this to Nora directly. He said it to Rolf. Rolf told Marta. Marta mentioned it to Clara Whitmore. Clara eventually told Nora. This was roughly how information moved through the settlement, and Nora did not mind the indirection. The acknowledgement reached her. That was enough. The second winter, 1875 into 1876, was not as brutal as the first. Cold snaps arrived, serious but brief. The families who had repacked their walls the previous summer noticed the difference. Appreciable, but not dramatic. They burned less wood, maintained more even temperatures, woke to warmer mornings. The test conditions were not as extreme, so the margin was not as stark. This is the nature of thermal mass. Its advantage shows most clearly at the extreme.